All right, so let's talk about perception. We're gonna start off with some general questions and comments and concerns about perception, then discuss some theories of perception before moving into whether perception requires consciousness. And as background for this, try to recall the idea of mental representation from early on in the semester, the idea being that your mind literally represents something. There's something that stands in for the outside world in some way. The idea of mental architectures, that there's different ways of organizing the mind, and in fact, some of these have very different aspects. When we discuss that, remember that some mental architectures were particularly good for some sensations. We're good at interpreting the results that we get from some of the sensations, but others weren't. And then lastly, consciousness, which we'll talk about a little more. So grab an object, but don't look at it. Grab a pen or something and close your eyes. Extend your arm out at a, 90-degree angle to your eye, straight out. And then open your eyes and slowly bring the object within view without moving your eyes or your head. And tell me when you think that you have seen the color of the object. If we did this in class, I would hand out some stuff and people would report different things and we talk about it. One of the interesting things is you view the objects as having color before you actually can perceive what color it is. This is one of these many visual illusions that we make for ourselves. You don't perceive that you have a blind spot in each eye, but in fact you do. You have a blind spot in your field of vision that your mind just fills in. The objects that you look at seem steady, but your eyes are saccading every second. In fact, if you were to set up an eye tracker and have a new image that followed your eye around, eventually you would be unable to see that image. It would blur into the background, which is kind of interesting. You have two eyes, you see a 3D image. You transmit the information upside down, but you see it right side up. All of these things. We'll talk about the various quirks that we have of perceptions, right? So the actual sensations that are getting into your head are not what you're perceiving. And perhaps you're not perceiving the outside world exactly, or maybe even at all. So we can raise this question what is perception doing? What is it for? And the obvious answer, the one that people for centuries have been trying to give is that perception is how you access the external world. You perceive the world as if it's outside of you in some way. But how does it get to be inside your head? We'll talk about this again on Wednesday when we get to concepts. It's one of the bigger questions. So what do we perceive? Concepts, I'm just going to bracket that. We're going to talk about it on Wednesday. That is a thing that the ordering of when to talk about concepts is tricky because they come up throughout. Actually, everything in this class comes out throughout all of the other sections. Ordering this class is kind of tricky. Sensory qualities. Sometimes you just hear a pop sound or an ouch, or you see a light, right? Sometimes you see things that are just the various sensory qualities. Sometimes you don't see the sensory qualities, you see them as objects, right? You see ships and shoes and sealing wax and cabbages and kings, these particular entities. Sometimes you see, and we'll talk about concepts later, but the idea is you can maybe see things as other things. You can see a king as royalty rather than as a particular entity, as a particular object. Right? Each of these is more conceptual than the previous one. And some people might deny that we see some of these, but I think by and large, a lot of people will accept that we can at least perceive sensory qualities. We can, if everything's going well, you perceive them as objects separate from your head. And then the last one could be a little trickier. Okay. But that's not always the case, right? Like sometimes you look at the world and the things that you think you see in the world are not actually what's there. These are optical illusions or hallucinations or dreams or mirages. We have lots of words for these phenomena, right? That you think you perceive something. And sometimes it's almost exactly as if real life. You can't tell the difference. And yet, from being around this long, you know that they aren't real life. So maybe they're at least a different kind of thing than the world that we perceive outside of us. So that's an issue. How do we make sense of these illusory perceptions? There's another issue about how to even individuate senses, right? Like how could it be that sights, sounds, smells, tastes, proprioception, that feeling that you have of balance, your internal temperature, those things, how can those all be the same thing? Same with internal and external senses, or more cognitive or bodily sensations, right? We seem to have a variety of things going on. We call them out all something, and what is the thing that unites them? And so there's a couple of views we'll talk about. Some people might intuitively think, in fact, we teach this in elementary school. You're like, you have eyes and you have ears and you have a mouth and you have a nose and I guess general skin. But anatomy is a really bad guide to perception because there are some aspects of your anatomy that are used for multiple perceptual processes, right? Like you use your smell for taste, and you can even taste some things that you smell. You can feel things in various ways. And it's not obvious that the five senses that you talk about in elementary school are the only senses you have. In fact, very few people I know think that they are. But I mean, the way I always think about this, it's, these are all systems that evolved at different times and places using other systems that are going on at the same time, right? Like it'd be weird if we all just evolved little modules that were perceptual modules. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. So there's stuff in the world. They are perceived in some way. Like your body is sensitive to external or internal input, just input. And then there's something called sensory transduction, which is how it's translated into the thing that eventually becomes perceptual properties. So you don't see your eyes darting around. You don't see the blind spot in your visual field. You will tune out your own sound. Like there's a bunch of things that we know that we aren't perceiving accurately. And so this suggests that, in fact, trying to figure out what the senses are might not be that easy. Because the perception isn't just the sense organs. There's a bigger, longer process. Okay. So now that we've got that as set up, let's see if we can develop some theories to talk about each of these. We were talking about perceiving sensory qualities, like quality emotions, psychological attitudes. We're talking about perceiving objects, right? one of the things that's interesting is we're able to bind properties to objects. You look at a person and you see them as having the property of being loud or whatever, being tall. You see these things, these sensory qualities, and you don't think that they're in your head. You attach it to the object outside of you. These, and then the higher level categories. When we get to the concept section, this will connect a little bit better. But the basic idea is, it seems like you can perceive things as just or unjust, as good or bad, as happy or sad. You look at a puppy and you see it as happy. It like brings about things. You see it as a thing. Some people like to make the distinction between seeing and seeing as. I don't know. So it could be any of these things, and all of the others could just be versions of the other, or of each other. Or perception could be a kind of cognition, a kind of thought. It is, in some sense, a kind of thought. It is something that's going on in your mind. But what the hell could that be? And so people wrestle with this in a variety of ways. One of possibilities that it might, a mental state could be a perception if it has a certain functional role, like it just serves as mediating between you and the outside environment. In which case, perception just is a thing that helps you understand the outside environment. And so something like extrasensory perception, like, and I don't mean like the SP, like the telepathy or whatever, but it's not ridiculous. You could imagine having some understanding that's not tied directly to one of your senses. And that would count as a perception if that was the case, which seems a little strange. Maybe it's a kind of thought, it's a kind of cognition that has a specific format. Okay, I don't know exactly what that means, but sure. Maybe if you thought about it in the context of mental architecture, it would be easier to make sense of what a perception is. So we've talked about classical computationalist architecture and connectionism. And one interesting thing is that depending on how you view the mind as being organized, depending on your view of architecture, your understanding of perception changes drastically. So the classicalist view is also associated with a view called the modularity of the mind. This is the view that there are various roughly self-contained units in the mind that allow one to process things very quickly, automatically, thinking fast versus thinking slow. And so perception would be tied to senses that were like this. You'd have perceptual systems that were modular and roughly independent of the rest of your mind. The alternative would be a connectionist system, which, if you recall, is a fully distributed system. But if there's no difference between, if in a connectionist system, because everything is so distributed, there's no way to actually individuate things, treat things as separate. In which case, there would be no distinction between perception and thought. There'd be no difference between anything and anything else, right? Like, representations are weird in connectionist systems. So if representations are weird, how the hell can you get perception to be a separate kind of thing? Connectionist systems just give you the outcome that you want based on certain inputs. They don't really reflect how we think about the world. Okay. So we've raised some issues for perception. We've We've talked about what it is, what it is that you perceive. We've talked about various ideas of how we understand um, what kind of thing perception could even be. So there's this basic problem here, which is that it seems like perceptions are things going on inside your head, but they are about things outside of your head, or at least many of them are. We think about them as being mind independent. That is, you see these objects as if they are not in your head. We think about, and this is literally everything you perceive. Like, this is like looking at your hand, looking at the mouse, looking at whatever's in front of you. You think about it as not being in your head. You think about it as being immediate. You don't see a very big delay between the world and you. Right? You think about it as happening at that moment. Some people will also add like a third category here that that we can reveal. Introspection can only tell us about the objects, but not other aspects of. They can only tell us that objects exist, but not other features of it. But the first two are the ones that matter, right? So mind independent, and it seems to be present. Okay. So I want to divide various views of perception into these rough distinctions. Perception could be about the world, or it could be about your senses. And then there's an answer to what are illusions, right? So we're going to go through each of these in turn. But the basic idea is some views have perceptions to be how your mind represents reality. In the naive view, illusions are problems. There's another view that views illusions as just mistakes. There's another view that says that illusions just aren't really perceptions, there's something else. And then there's another view that says, okay, it's not, you're not viewing reality, you're just talking about whatever the hell it is that you're sensing. It's just whatever that experience that you have in your head right now. That's sense data theory. And so illusions kind of drop out of the question here because whether you connect to reality or not is up in the air. So start off with naive realism. What we perceive is how the world is. I think a lot of people assume that this is how perception works. Even though we know about hallucination, right? Like we know that there are instances where we're wrong, and this is what motivated Rene Descartes that started off modern philosophy. But I think there's a deep problem here, right? Like the deep problem is it's not just that you could be wrong right now. It's that if there's no way to determine within your head good versus bad experience, that is illusory versus real experiences, then it's not like there's like this like watermark of your experience that that tells you that something's the real world. There's not like a thing that says you're not dreaming right now. So then the question is, how could even accurate experiences involve a direct awareness of the world? Let me try to say that again. If you could be fooled like this, then it seems like your system isn't good enough to be able to perceive the world. Instead, you have a system that is good at fooling you. And what leads you to be confident that your perceptual system could ever directly perceive the world? Maybe it's just the thing that's good at making the world, or at fooling you. Okay. So naive realism is this view that I think a lot of people start off with, but very quickly you have to abandon it for something else. And so then there's this alternative, this view, intentionalism sometimes is called, or representationalism, which is basically that perceiving is having cognitive content, that is, there's content in your head, um, and that is you're perceiving something, uh, and accurate perception is just accurate. You're accurately representing it, and other times you're literally making a mistake. Um, and so, one of the things that's fascinating about this is when you think about it, you often represent the world in ways that you are not actually seeing. Um, you look at a friend, you see them in the eyes, and you assume that they have a back of their head. You look at somebody in a Zoom box and you assume that they're wearing like socks, or that they don't have like 8 legs, right? And so that's fine. Um, you're perceiving them as something, and sometimes you're right, and sometimes you're wrong. Uh, you okay? So you raise some issues. Um, well, here's something weird, and I think this is going to be a problem for some of the other views as well. Why is it that some sensory modalities aren't other sensory modalities? Why is it that when I look at you, I see you rather than hear you? Rather, or when I hear you, I don't smell you. I hear you on the computer screen and I don't smell it. Like, why is it perceiving as a certain thing? These are all going to be questions for perception in general. Representationalists, they want to just sort of eat their cake and have it too, right? Like, they want to treat perception as being about the world when it works, and all of these instances where you have some problems where you're filling in information that you don't really have, or questions that you raise about how you're perceiving things this way as opposed to some other way that is like presumably possible to experience the world as, um, those those are just that's just happenstance. It's just how you happen to perceive the world. But okay, moving on down the scale of anti-realism, um, you might say illusions aren't a kind of perception at all. Perceiving just is um, interacting with mind-independent objects. And when you don't have that, you're not having a perception. And so you might not be aware of it, sure. Um, but that's just what it is. Like, I mean, in a sense, disjunctivism and representationalism um, might be redefining the problem. Like, if you an illusion for a disjunctivist is just half of a perception, whereas an illusion for a representationalist is an incorrect perception. Um, and so when there is an external object and you are perceiving it, you can raise the same questions that we raised for the representationalist. Why do you see rather than hear? Why do you hear rather than smell? Whatever. Um, I find that this might be just a matter of philosophical taste, which one you prefer there. actually for all of these. The sense datum theory, on the other hand, is just that this will take a step away from the external world altogether and say, no, what we're actually perceiving isn't the world. We're not perceiving objects. We're perceiving sense data, and whatever those are, you know, whatever it is that you think a sense is. It's a functional kind rather than some unified kind of thing. Senses and perceptions are a kind of thing in and of themselves, and that's just where we are. Senses are a thing, and you can take an extra step saying that there's an external world that these senses are perceiving, that these senses are latching onto in some way, but that is making an extra step. That is something that might not be justified by the philosophy. So that sort of makes sense. At one extreme, we have this naive realism, which is that the world is what it is. In the middle, we have these views that are just going to be various versions of the idea that perception is just, it could be, it is about objects, it is about things in the world. And in one view is that when you have an illusion, you're wrong. In the other view, it's just not possible because illusions are just a different thing. They're like, a perception is a two-part process rather than a single-part process. Sense datum theory is going to just leave the world out of it altogether. Like the next step beyond the sense data is connecting your perceptions to the real world, but that is the project that has motivated 400 years of philosophy, right? And they think that maybe you can't actually do that. No, I actually don't think that they'd go that far, but it's an extra thing to do. All right, let's quickly watch a video. I'm gonna see if I can share this screen.
Don't just make a blog.
All right, right now I'm sharing an ad.
The perfect place to WordPress.
I really do like Blue
Today we're going to play a game specifically designed to test your spatial awareness. Meet the Brain Games Double Dutch team. What does jumping rope have to do with the brain? Well, Double Dutch requires off-the-chart spatial awareness. Today, these kids are going to help us test yours. For this game, all you have to do is keep track of the number of times that either of the girls in green jumps. You'll count each time one of them lands a jump, like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As you can see, these jumpers are pretty quick on their feet, so you're going to have to pay attention to keep up. When the whistle blows, start counting. Ready? Go. So, how many jumps did the green team make? Did you say 38? If so, you agreed with 40% of our test audience. Now, some of you may be onto us, but for those of you who aren't, did you happen to notice anything else going on during the Double Dutch? Maybe a giant chicken strolling right through the middle of the set and doing a funky chicken dance? Now, some of you may have missed that funky chicken, but many of you probably saw it, and that's okay. because the chicken was just there to distract you too. Here's the real question. What color was the wall behind the double Dutch game? Here's a hint. It wasn't the same color at the end as it was when they started jumping. The back wall was changing color the entire time, from bright blue to bright red. Nearly everyone misses it. But why? It turns out there's far too much information coming in through the eyes at any given moment for the brain to fully process all of it. As a result, the brain has to act like a spotlight, focusing our attention on some parts of the scene but not others. Now, most of you were probably paying attention to the jumpers, and some of you may have suspected that something strange was going to happen, so you saw the chicken. But you probably weren't paying attention to the back wall. And what we don't pay attention to, we don't see. And hey, for those of you who managed to catch everything so far, did you notice that we also swapped the rope turners out halfway through?
Be honest, do you really want to watch?
Ads. I love that video. It just keeps messing with you. So, okay. We've been talking about perceptions, various views of perception, various issues with perception. Does perception require consciousness? Arguments in favor of it might include that things like that video, flashbulb memories. These are memories of like particularly important or traumatic events in your life, where it turns out that you perceive things happening very, very quickly, or sorry, very slowly, despite the fact that your perception is not actually better than you think it is. People have measured these, like when people are jumping off planes or whatever, they've measured to see if you can see more. You can't. It just so happens that we're layering more and more memories over, we're paying attention to every detail. Scene perception. This is another instance where you have like a slowly changing scene and you're not paying attention. So it seems like awareness, which has a connection to consciousness, that's kind of tricky and hard to disentangle, might be required for perception. But then there's instances that might go against it, right? So these are subliminal states, non-conscious qualia. These are so qualia we talked about were sense perceptions, but sometimes we have, well, there's evidence that we have them that I have not been able to fully understand myself. There are people that really push for this, including one of my colleagues. Also, you'll notice that after you've experienced something, if somebody asks you immediately afterward about it, sometimes you can reverse sense what was just happening, right? Like, do you remember how your socks felt a couple of seconds ago? Or how your teeth feel, right? Like, there are certain things that you just, by adding attention to it after the fact, you realize you actually were perceiving it. So, all right. I think at the end of the day, I'm not sure I have strong opinions on any of these. Maybe to some respect, yes. Maybe there's just a bunch of processes going on all at once, and it's this kind of a miracle if we like are aware of any of them. I don't know. This is a long video, and I'm gonna end it now. See ya.